So if you could all come up and join us closer to the front. There's going to be stickies coming around because I'm going to put you all to work because it's 4 o'clock, and as in adult education, you need to be doing something to be able to pay attention past, well, I was going to say 2 o'clock, but 4 o'clock. And you should always start out light. The Nobel Peace Prize winners, they get the 9 o'clock spot. The future winners, well, we get the 4 o'clock spot. So thank you for staying. I'm going to first just introduce my esteemed panel, and then we're going to get started.
Esteemed.
So we're going to start first with Brian Geiger. And he is the Vice President of Enterprise Risk at RBC, responsible for recovery, resolution planning, compliance. And Brian and I met a while ago, actually, as he spoke to one of my undergrad risk management classes. So we've kind of come full circle. Then beside him, we have Carrie Renke, who's the Chief Risk Officer of Enterprise Risk Management at Manulife Canada, and also responsible for enterprise market insurance operational risk, as well as for the entire of Manulife Worldwide, risk governance, risk appetite, stress testing, and just throw in a whole bunch of other stuff along with that. So thank you, Carrie. Beside him, congratulations go out to, and Gary, I'm going to try and get this right. Wojnakowski.
Very good.
Oh.
It's Irish.
Okay, I've got through the hardest part of today. And he is the new Acting Deputy Minister and Provincial Controller of the Office of the Provincial Controller, Treasury Board Secretariat of the Government of Ontario. Now, he told me it's acting, but he's been doing more than his job for a long time, so they better keep him. And on the far end, we have Stephen Richards, Director of Business Planning and Enterprise Risk Management at the CPPIB. And it's a small knit community in risk management, and he also used to work at Manulife, where he was in corporate risk. So it really is a small community. So we're going to get started, and I'll sort of lay out what we're going to do today. And first, we're going to talk about a risk management framework, and that's really around, we've heard risks being identified all through the day, and we started back in the morning with Robert Engel and climate change. We've heard technology risks all across the board, a bit of geopolitical risks. Those risks have been identified for you. But the question then becomes, for your organizations, well, what do you then do? How do you look at the interaction? And I didn't get a chance to thank Susan Labarge for her comment right at the end around it really is looking out at the horizon and the correlation of those risks that we see coming outside of the standard the standard risk management that you face every day. So that's where the Global Risks and Trends Framework has come from. And as we look at an increasingly complex world, these risks are based on the risks and trends identified by the World Economic Forum. And I'm not going to go through sort of them all, but as you look at them, and one of the other research initiatives that I have undertaken today is looking at 2007, 2017, 18, and then looking out into the future of 3 scenarios for 2030, and to say, how is the world changing and where are those trends going to? So since you've stayed, you get to go on a trip with me. So we are going to go to Davos. And I want you to be thinking about risks and trends as we go to Davos, except we arrive in Davos and it's been snowing, and it's snowing and snowing and snowing, and the snowpack has built up so high that there's avalanche warnings coming out. keeps on snowing, and that last snowflake triggers an avalanche, and the town of Davos is wiped out below. But I want you to make the link to, is it the snowpack? Or is it the last snowflake? Or is it the drop in temperature? Or is it the winds that have caused the avalanche? Similar to the trends that have built up over time, such as the disparity of income and wealth, or climate change, or urbanization. Or is it the last snowflake? Is it the cyber attack? Is it, illicit trade? Or is it the combination and correlation and relationships of those things together? So this is kind of going to be like graft on speed dating, because I'm only going to talk for 20 minutes, and then I'm going to talk over to these guys who have actually started to put it in practice over the last year. So why are you interested in graft? Well, it's basically a systematic way to look at those risks and trends, and to have a platform that you can use to discuss with your management, with your employees, with your board, that enhances understanding. So like any good framework, we've got some pictures to go with it. So what sort of makes it differentiable? Well, when you think about the risks and trends, you want it to be linked to your own organization. So it's really linked to, what is your strategy? Okay, so here's the working part. So I want you all to get a yellow sticky. So get out your stickies. And I want you, for your own organization, to identify one strategy. And if you don't have a sticky, come up and get one from another table. Can't hide back there. So identify what that strategy is. And write it down. It's all right, I'm not going to ask you to share it. In other sessions, I would. I did this session with a bunch of Chinese bankers, and they really had a good time with it. Okay, so you've got your strategy. So you're thinking about your own organization. Now, along with strategic planning, what makes strategic planning sort of work out into the future is to think about, what are the strategic assumptions that you have made in putting that strategy out there? And I know, because many of you are in risk, and when you think of risk modeling, we always go back to, what are the assumptions? But when you build strategic planning, often the underlying strategic assumptions that the strategy is based upon are not identified. So my best example just got taken away, but I'm going to use it anyways. So you think about the strategic plans of the organizations in Canada, and one of sort of the unwritten strategic assumptions was that we are going to continue to trade with the US under NAFTA. Well, now it's the YSMCA. That was a joke. So I want you now, for your strategy, so take a blue sticky. I want you to identify 2 strategic assumptions that you've made for that strategy in order to work. No, I took those out. So the strategic assumptions may be around having an available technology workforce. It may be about interest rates. It may be about stability of weather, or of a environment where you have rule of law, where you have privacy of information, where you have stability of computer systems, What are the underlying assumptions that you have made to enable your strategy to actually work? So the reason that I've had you do this is because when you think about the global risks and trends, it's very challenging to link those global risks and trends to your strategy. But if you are thinking about risks and trends, it's a lot easier to make that link back to the strategic assumptions that you have made about your strategy. So we'll go back to our NAFTA example. So if you think about NAFTA as one of the underlying strategic assumptions, suddenly the rise of nationalism, the rise of populism, the impact of unemployment link into that decision-making process. Or if we go to the Brexit vote, suddenly involuntary migration has a lot more to do with your underlying strategy than you actually thought it did. So I'm going to run you through a very quick look at those risks and trends. And as you are running through them, I want you to be thinking about identifying 2 risks. So get another color, get orange. Orange for risks. And what do we got left? Do we have green? We have green for trends. So I want you to be thinking about your 2 top risks and your 2 top trends. Okay. So some geopolitical risk. Well, lots of stuff going on around the world. We've got our neighbors next door that we didn't necessarily used to think of as big political risk leaders. We've got, the potential breakup of the EU. We've got China's influence through the Belt and Road Initiative and the South China Seas. We've got the conflict that's going on continually in the Middle East. On the socio-political, if you look at the little mountains on the right and you think about what's going on in the US, the 2 parties' underlying values used to be fairly similar, but as you can see from Pew's research, that divergence in values and then that making that link to the change in understanding of why they're making the decisions that they make. And then if we think of involuntary migration, the involuntary migration that we hear about is generally focused on the 1 to 2 million that have moved into Europe. But there is another 58 million people around the world that are trapped in this involuntary migration. And as we look at the world changing, especially in Africa, the decisions that they are making will influence organizations such as yourselves. On to economic. Well, the trend of rising wealth, income, and disparity. 2 years ago, it was 162 people. Last year, it was 62 people. This year, it's 8 people that have the same amount of wealth as 3.6 billion people. And if you think about the power structure of who controls and who makes decisions, this group now has more influence than most governments. And especially when you put that together with sovereign debt, who holds the sovereign debt, you have to be thinking about what are the influences that are being made. Technology. Well, we've got rising threats and also rising cyber dependency. And if you look at those hand in hand, and I'm sure as I look out, many of you have children and teenagers and even farther than that, and you're quite familiar with cell phone as appendage. And the millennials that you are dealing with as they come into your organizations are working in a different way, as well as your customers are working in a different way. Climate change we heard of from this morning from more of a portfolio view, but this graph in the middle really gave me insight. This was my light bulb moment, because I grew up in Saskatchewan, and when you talk about global warming, we're like, bring it on. Not minus 40, it's only going to be minus 38. Yay! But it's not just increasing temperature, it's the middle graph, which is increasing variability in temperature and the linkage to extreme weather events. Now, sort of many of the weather scientists have now moved climate change into a risk factor, but I still like it as a trend because it's not event-based. And then, extreme weather events, last year, $350 billion. So it is firmly sort of moved into the #1 spot from that point of view. Okay, before we do this, so 2 risks and 2 trends for your organization. Pick your top 2 risks and top 2 trends. So for organizations, often what we do is we take them through a ranking and prioritizing of those. So we don't do it in 5 minutes, but we look at those based on currency. So now 5 to 10 years, out to 30 years, and also looking at severity and probability to come up with an impact factor. So this gives you the graph matrix, and what you see down on the bottom are the risks, and at the top are the trends from current urgency out into the future, with high impact at the bottom up to low impact, and then for the trends, similarly in the blue and the green, high to low impact current out to future. And what this process does is helps organizations visually look at how they have prioritized and to have discussions around, well, is that really more or less? And it is a qualitative method, but it's a qualitative method that gives you a visual to have the discussion around how does that link back to our strategic assumptions. What are the relationships with other risks and trends that we may not have seen in the past? So once you've ranked your risks and trends, we want to look a little deeper at those relationships. So we go through what's called a correlation matrix to identify, what are the linkages between those risks and trends? And for some organizations that we've worked with, what you see is that relationships come out that you would not necessarily have identified before. If you think of higher education and involuntary migration, that wouldn't necessarily have jumped out before, but when you look at it, that really does make a lot of sense. So I want you to think about your risks and trends and to think about the correlation of those risks and trends or the relationship back to the strategic assumption that you've identified. So some research that has been published lately, we looked at the correlations of cyber dependency, cyber attacks, data fraud, and theft. And those were linked into nation-state attacks. If you think about the different actors, so the rise of nationalism, we looked at illicit trade and how that was propelling cyber attacks. So looking at how those factors are increasing and linking those back to where do we see our potential exposures, but on the trend side as well for cyber dependency, where do we see the upsides for our business and for our organization? So I'm not going to run through sort of all of the strategic implications, but this was published last October. If you build it, they will come, and they're here to sort of share some of their insights into emerging risk and some predictions about rising interest rates, rising inflation, sort of the move that Canada was going to be on are published in a case study that are on our website. So we have applications to banking, to government, to pension funds as well. Okay, so we're going to move over to our panel. So Brian,
Yes.
Can you hear me? Hello? I'm going to start with you. So we've asked our audience to identify their risks. Can you talk to us about risks at Royal Bank and emerging risks?
Sure, yeah. And thanks for having me as part of the panel. It's a great opportunity for me, so appreciate that. There's obviously a number of emerging risks that we track on an ongoing basis at RBC. There's a couple that I wanted to talk about. The first one I do feel a bit silly talking about because it was largely settled over the weekend, but I did want to raise the topic of NAFTA and the potential tear-up of NAFTA that we were keeping an eye on for a number of months now. This was an interesting one, and I do want to talk about it just because it was a good case study for the emerging risk team that we've set up at RBC that we'll talk about later. And so it was a good opportunity to look at the operating model for that group and really run through a particular issue from start to finish. And really the analysis of the potential NAFTA tear-up started with looking at the potential scenarios, of course, what were likely outcomes, what was the macroeconomic backdrop to all of that, including escalating tariffs globally, and really trying to paint the macroeconomic picture. From there, we really drilled into, okay, which sectors do we think are most at risk? And that was largely based on a shifting Twitter narrative, of course, that as different sectors were being targeted by the president. But there's clearly risk around the dairy sector, around automotive, obviously the high-profile sectors that were named over and over. So we started looking into those, and the next step then was to take a look at our wholesale portfolio, so our corporate lending and our trading activities, and really think about how those sectors fit into the wholesale portfolio, either directly or indirectly. And then from that, just thinking about the correlations and the trends here. Also, how does that potentially impact our retail book? And started thinking about our consumer lending, our mortgage portfolios. Are they concentrated in areas that may be affected by auto tariffs, for example? And looking into those types of questions. So we pulled all that together and then provided a briefing to our chief risk officer and other senior management, and then ran with it to provide regular updates to the board of directors. So like I said, provided a good opportunity to look at our operating model for that team. And so even though it was it's largely settled over the weekend, it was still a really interesting exercise to work through. The other one I would talk about is cryptocurrencies, and this is one that I find the interest and the level of discussion around cryptocurrencies at RBC is really correlated to the price of Bitcoin. So last little while, it's been a little bit quieter on this front for sure. But it's been a really interesting topic to really dive into. And it was really, we were heavily into this topic sort of January to April. Really what we tried to do is establish what RBC's risk framework around cryptocurrencies should look like, at least as a first cut. And we started looking into developing what we call guardrails around the different strategies. And we looked at RBC's businesses and how they may be affected by the prevalence of cryptocurrency. We looked at the different clients that we deal with and how they may be affected by cryptocurrency, and really tried to build out a framework of sort of the go and no-go zones around what we may want to do in the future. So that was definitely a very interesting topic, and part of that actually, we became somewhat of an educational function as well, and tried to really delineate the concepts of blockchain, cryptocurrency, and Bitcoin, and try to make sure that people understood that as we worked with our operational risk teams, other risk management teams, and businesses to make sure that everybody understood the different pieces that we're referring to. So, like I say, lots of different topics that we look at, but those are two hot topics recently.
Excellent. Carrie, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So a few things that maybe I'll touch on, and a little compare and contrast with the graph is that I'd say our framework is highly correlated with it. And when we look at our evolving risks, and we actually call them evolving risks, not emerging risks, very purposely, we would argue that most of the risks that are identified in there really aren't new, and it's the underlying nature of it that's evolving, and hence the name evolving risks. And so I think our first point of reference is that we actually track, not necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about new risks, but how are the risks that we already have evolving and changing over time. And so some of the examples that I'll dig in, we obviously spent a lot of time on technology today. And with that lens, the second thing that we look at is there's the big macroeconomic risks, geopolitical risks, and that's one category of it. And then we, for lack of a better term, call them business model risks. And they're very, very different. But to go back to your correlations, we then try to start mapping them through, and then we find a lot of correlations. So I'm going to use one example to sort of show how it goes through all of those, and that's technology risks that we spent a lot of time on today. So when we look at technology risks, we don't necessarily look at a lot of specific underlying risks when we get to the evolving risk framework. Rightly or wrongly, an underlying assumption that our business units, the technology teams, they're spending a ton of time on that, so let's not duplicate that. But we then step back and say, what are some of the bigger picture issues that we have to think about to get back to your strategy? And so when we look at it, evolving risks, less so about the specific technologies, but then we can very specifically get to how is that going to change the business models of our existing competitors or potential new competitors. And so hopefully most of you know a little bit about Manulife. A big portion of our business is our group benefits business in Canada. And so with the rise of technology, the potential for benefits exchange, how they're going to use technology and how that's going to interrupt us. And so that's one example of it. The second one, and again, the evolving nature of it. When we talk about emerging risks, we actually don't talk about cybersecurity at all. Cybersecurity is a risk. It's not an emerging risk. It's hitting you every day, and if you're dealing with that separately, our point of view is you have a big problem. And so we spend very little time talking about that in an emerging risk context. But I really like the point made earlier today about understanding your threat vectors. And so the traditional cybersecurity, no, but a huge amount of time spent on disruptions to financial infrastructure. And so if we can control, well, we can't control, but we have some level of influence on the specific threats to Manulife. But when we heard this morning about national threats to, be it from Russia, whoever you want, depending on who you think is your friend or enemy at any given time. But it would be crippling to take down the payments infrastructure. It would be crippling to take down the central clearinghouses. And again, tying it back into our business, in the insurance business, extremely complex balance sheet. We rely a lot on lengthening swaps and derivatives to actually manage our asset liability management. The clearing system goes down, we have a massive problem. So we do spend a lot of time specifically thinking about financial infrastructures, just that next layer down. And then the last part, and this is when I sort of transition from the business operations into the macro, is that if you go back to business models, there's business models that'll disrupt us, but then there's potential disruptive business models in the economy more broadly. Perhaps unfair, I might overcharacterize it, but yeah, I think of a typical bank balance sheet as having a 5-year duration, give or take a few years. Our duration stretches to 30 years or more. And so that means that when we're managing our balance sheet, we have to find a lot of long credit. And when you think about long credit, you have a choice of basically government bonds or corporate debt. And I don't know about any of you, but how many of you here want to bet on any one corporate entity actually still existing 30 years from now? And so that's sort of an example of getting into the correlation. Then you get into the macroeconomic side. What are the evolving risks related to our long credit portfolio, and how are we going to address that? So hopefully that provides you a flavor of how we're looking at it.
Right. And then we're going to go down to the end. Stephen, who also has a long outlook. Do you want to give us your view on
We do. At CPPIB, as a global long-term investor, obviously we're worried about all of these things, all of the things that Brian and Carrie just described. Obviously not just from a risk perspective, but also from an opportunity perspective. We're in a good position to take advantage of the upside on some of these trends and risks. But in terms of our framework for how we look at the risks or the uncertainties, I mean, I agree with Carrie's comments about it's questionable whether some of these things are emerging risks given that they're hitting us now. But a couple of the things we do, 3 or 4 things actually. One is from an overall strategic planning perspective, we identify what we call critical uncertainties. And those cover many of the topics we've talked about. So they're economic, they're geopolitical, demographic, climate change, disruptive technology. And we look at what the plausible range of outcomes could be for each of those uncertainties. And we really try to focus on plausible because that tries to get people to stretch their thinking about the range of possible outcomes. And then we consider for each of those range of outcomes, for each of those risks or trends, what the impacts could be to the asset management industry, but also specifically to us as an investor and our portfolio. And then think about what are the types of things we might want to monitor to get a sense for whether the possible impact or timing or likelihood of each of those things is changing. So that's from a overall sort of strategic planning perspective at the top of the house. If we go a level down, we establish very focused forums or working groups to focus on some of these individual topics in more detail. So for example, we have a cross-functional scenario analysis working group that dives into geopolitical risk and actually creating a geopolitical risk radar and then actually running scenario analysis to identify what the impact of geopolitical events could be on our portfolio. We do the same, well, I don't want to overstate what we do for climate change, but we do have, some of the people in this room are involved in this, but we do have also a climate change program, which again is bringing together a cross-functional team of people with different skills to look at, again, what some of the possible, how climate change could evolve and what the impacts to us could be. And we do the same on technology. So those are more the risk or trend-specific groups that get into the detail on each of those. And then the last thing I'd mention is just obviously as part of regular risk reporting, we're always monitoring the external environment and reporting up on how those things are evolving as we go. So I'd say those are the main things we're doing.
Okay. So I've saved Gary for last because if you think banking is complex, trying to manage risk across a government. So Gary, can you tell us about...
Sure, thanks. So prior to the current position I'm in, I was the Director of Enterprise Risk Capacity and Assurance at the Treasury Board Secretariat. And our role, and my team's role, was really to begin to look at and building a broader framework for understanding and assessing risk across an incredibly complex organization, 65,000 people with facets and aspects right across all multiple lines of business, $140 billion size of an organization, and an organization that's very much focused on risk and has been for forever. When we say 30 years into the future, will the entity still exist? Yes, it has existed and will continue to exist. The role that we played is really taking a step back to say, how should we begin to look at risk in a public sector context? And how can we begin to establish it in a way that will resonate with all aspects, all activities, all actions that occur across a diverse public sector? And Our group did an extensive amount of research, focusing on the financial sector, which I think we found was one of the most advanced in terms of managing risk and understanding risk within the context of the work that the sector does. But we also focused on other public sectors and found that there were more challenges than successful attempts at building a broader risk framework. You have to understand, is in the public sector, we are great risk managers. But how do we begin to articulate it in a way to really understand it at the enterprise level, and where is that enterprise level? So the team, through that research, really worked on focusing on how do we begin to define the objectives and what we're trying to achieve in terms of the larger aspects of the GRAFT model. I think GRAFT model really brings that out, and we've defined really 4 business lenses through which we operate and function within. The first really being strategy and the strategic focus, driving policy, making policy decisions, and a whole approach to looking at assessing and understanding risk as you're developing your strategy, which differs from when you take that strategy and it manifests itself into a project, into actions, into realizing that strategy. There's a whole another way of thinking about risk, assessing risk, understanding risk, and managing that. And likewise, when that project moves into operations, again, another approach to understanding and assessing risk, and likewise managing contingency should there be a significant failure. So establishing that framework has really enabled us to begin the conversation across the enterprise, to focus on what outcomes are we intending to achieve, what then is the methodology that we should begin to use to understand and apply risk that will enable us to compare and cross-compare those risks in those various lenses, that then will enable and support us in making those best decisions depending on the nature of the work that we're doing. So I think the complexity, and you see it very much in the GRAFT model, and that's certainly work that we've done with GRI, in understanding how those large risks and trends can influence organizations over extended periods of time, and how should you begin to consider that as you develop and drive out strategy.
Excellent. So we're going to come back to RBC, and if you can talk a little bit, sort of, we've heard about the risks, and then just talk about your team and some of the things, and how do you actually sort of push that down in the organization, and how do you move it up?
Perfect, yeah. So within my area of enterprise risk, we established an emerging risk team back in 2017. So we just rolled over the 1-year mark, really. And it's been a good move for us, I think, in the sense that it's really shown the value of carving out a team to focus on these new risks, these evolving risks. I might steal that and take it back to RBC. I think it's been really good to have people to focus on that and kind of remove themselves from other day-to-day activities and really raise those issues and bring them forward. So the idea really of the team is to work with our colleagues all around the bank and try to help with that identification of risks and bringing them forward and sort of looking across those risks to see, are there correlations, are there links between risks that we're seeing in one area that should be dialed into another area, and try and really foster those links and raise awareness of them. And I think the escalation part is important as well. It helps to, sort of, again, draw information from a number of different sources and provide that to the Chief Risk Officer and others, such as the board as well. And we're still shaping the mandate. I mean, it still is a bit of a work in progress. It's been about a year. We're trying to figure out exactly how we should operate, but we are trying to keep it fairly flexible to adapt to different risks as need be. So it's been really an interesting voyage so far. One of the key things we are trying to do is ensure that there is a link between these emerging risks and our strategy across different businesses. This came up a number of times. It's been raised by this panel as well as the preceding panel as well about embedding risk within business strategy. And we're really trying to do that at the emerging risks as well. We're trying to make sure that happens. And one of the things we did was embedded in what we call our business portfolio review process. So at the line of business level every year, as they're setting strategy for the next year, next 3 years, really ensure that there's healthy, robust discussion around emerging risks. And that helps just to keep the topic going and make sure that people are thinking about it. But then it also provides us with a bit of a database, really, of those those emerging risks that we can sort of bring together and look at in a graph-like framework. So that's been really valuable as well, and I think at RBC it's a big focus to try and tie together risk and strategy. So I think we've been successful in embedding emerging risk into that. So it's something that's evolving. It's definitely it's changing in its own right. We're still trying to figure out exactly how to make it work, but I think we've had some good successes so far, looking at specific topics and really driving the narrative across the bank.
Carrie?
So a few things I'll highlight. I think our framework may be somewhat similar, but we don't necessarily have a dedicated team at this point. But we do have a very broad cross-company working group on evolving risks. So they are drawn from our investments team, Asian operations itself, the corporate team. And we'll meet at least twice a year. And really the purpose of it is to keep ourselves honest. So our underlying philosophy is that evolving risk, evolving issues, again, similar to what I said at the beginning, is that has to be embedded in business planning in the day-to-day. And so what this really is a completeness check. And so it's meant to be that periodic, let's get our heads out of the day-to-day operations and let's make sure that we're being honest with ourselves, and if there's anything new out there that we're surfacing that. So that's one method, and then we embed it in just the regular risk assessments. So be it our risk committees, the business unit executive committees, at least every 3 months, once a quarter, stop. If you remember evolving risks, what's top of mind in evolving risks? And then we use that to develop our inventory, and then when it comes to strategy, we actually very rarely will have a specific evolving risks section. But what we will do is the risk teams are embedded in that evaluation, and basically that's their checklist. So they're going to contribute to the development of the strategy, but okay, we're talking about expanding into this channel, this technology is emerging, have they considered it? Yes, great. If not, well, there's your chance to raise your hand. We're very purposely trying to not create a separate process for evolving risk. A little bit of a hobby horse of mine. I think there's way too much risk activity that's discrete risk activity and isn't embedded in the process. I call it credenza-ware. You feel really, really good about the process, you document it all, and then it goes onto the shelf. And so we try to have very little actual specific paperwork related to evolving risks, but we want to be able to say, okay, here's the business unit strategy, here's how it gets into the geographic footprint, how does that tie into our overall summary? And if we can demonstrate that, we think not an unreasonable approach.
Right. And we're going to jump over to the end with Stephen.
Still here.
Do you want to add to our conversation?
Yeah, well, I will reiterate a bit of what Brian and Carrie already said. I think for us, I mentioned previously the 3 or 4 things that we were doing around identification and assessment of emerging risks in the strategic planning process. One, the focused groups to deep dive into specific emerging risks. That's the second thing, and the third thing is in our reporting. And what we have recently been focused on is we've actually taken an adapted version of the GRAFT framework, and we've incorporated it into our overall risk framework. And the intent there is to make the linkages in those processes more explicit. So I think, again, consistent with what Carrie said, we've embedded the risk work directly into the strategic plan, the strategic implementation plan, and we've embedded the emerging investment risk analysis directly into our investment reporting, and we're embedding other aspects of the work that these cross-functional groups are doing, including the climate change group, directly into strategy and directly into the risk reporting. So again, trying to avoid keeping them separate, rather embedding them and creating those linkages. And we found the graph to be quite helpful in establishing those links.
And what's next for you, Gary?
Yeah, I listen to the conversation, and I tend to, and I often, when I speak to this, we tend to talk about risk as, that 4-letter word, stop. And that risk comes up and it says, let's stop doing this. And I like the analogy of the fact that we have brakes in our vehicles, we have brakes in our cars, not to stop us, but actually to let us drive faster, to let us get to our destination quicker. And risk to me, and and mitigations to that risk, really we need to think of them as an approach to innovation. And how do we do things more effectively, more efficiently? How do we achieve our objectives in a much quicker way? Often say risk and innovation, two sides of the same coin. And that while we need to manage our risk and understand and put controls and mitigating factors in place for that, we should embrace that risk because it can help us achieve our objective faster. We need to focus on the positive side of risks and understanding and being able to identify them from that aspect, and really changing the culture or the way to think about risk within the broader public sector is critical moving forward. And recognizing that, yes, from an operational perspective, I'm dealing with other people's money. There's no appetite for fraud from an operations, and we need to address risk and understand risk in that context. But when I'm developing new approaches and thinking of strategy, building that car, so to speak, and putting those brakes in the car, I'm not putting the brakes in the car to stop, but actually to help me get faster. So how do we begin to think about risk in that context, that it's not about stop, a big stop sign, but rather a way to help us drive and drive faster to get to our, and safely, obviously. If we didn't have brakes in our car, we'd be driving very slow everywhere. So I think that's really where we're beginning to shift and try to take the organization as we go forward, as we begin to implement our framework that we just released a year ago. So it's very much a journey and an evolution as we go forward in understanding risk and applying it.
Sorry, Lewis, can I ask, I got to actually pose a question to this group, and you can find me afterwards. I was thinking about the framework, and one thing I've been struggling with, and I think organizationally we've been struggling at, I call it headline risk. Is that when you're dealing with evolving risks, it's very easy to get captured by the headlines of the day. In your example of NAFTA, there was probably 500 storylines over the course of the last year, and if you followed every single one of them, you'd waste an incredible amount of organizational resources. Same time you ignore them, you could miss something big. And I'll sort of be honest here, I'm not sure I've solved that issue. So if anyone has a solution to that, find me afterwards, please.
Well, one of the things that I think a lot about is sort of where are things going, and as I look out to 2030, to really be saying, okay, what are the underlying trends along with the noise of the events that we see? And that's, I don't know if that's an answer, but when because I'm a world events junkie, the Financial Times of London, that's my favorite. But that's how I try to put it into context. And as you sort of establish that trend, you can position the noise of the events. And whether that really hits home and is a turning point, like the example of Home Depot and Target in the Canada context of cyber threats and cyber insurance, whereas we had lots of noise before that. Those were sort of two turning events. So I'm going to turn it over to questions for our audience, for our panel. Is there anyone that would like to start?
I'll speak loudly. So I love this work around emerging risks and identifying them and speaking about them. One thing I would like to hear from the panelists is, when you have identified an emerging risk that you do think is something that really needs to be looked to, especially something that's 5-10 years down the road, how do you escalate that upwards, and does it go to as high level as the board?
I can start with that one. So it's an interesting problem that we're wrestling with a bit, because quite often people get focused on the here and now. And so I do think by carving this team out, and I know we have different sort of operating models around this, but I do think one of the things that's worked well at RBC is just having this team carved out and having sort of a good line and a good rapport with our chief risk officer, so a good line into them. And I think it's been really beneficial for us to have sort of call it sort of a safe space almost to say, here are a few things we're looking at. It's on our pipeline. We want to talk about these issues. We may not commit lots of resources, and if it's deemed that it's not necessarily worthwhile, but at least to have that conversation around what we're considering and what our pipeline looks like, to give us that opportunity to raise those issues. Some of them, there's limited resources. We can only tackle so many issues, but I think that's one of the ways that we do it, is just to have those conversations and make sure, whether it's the CRO or his operating committee, that they know what we're talking about and what we're thinking about.
Just to add on, a short answer is yes, all the way up to the board. Probably not surprisingly, a key tool is once we start to see that something is getting up there, we'll stress test it to say, do we have a reasonable estimate of whether or not we should care? And then the estimate of should we care is also probably the most common question we get back from the board, because I'll be honest with you, is that a lot of these emerging risks will say probably 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 of them, we think our existing strategy accommodates in one form or another. A big part of our asset liability management, the investment strategy, really isn't to take outsized bets on any one sector, any one investment. So your best defense against the big macroeconomic risks is a balanced portfolio. When you're talking about evolving risks, emerging risks, that really isn't a satisfying answer. It's probably the right answer, but it's not a satisfying answer. So stress tests, full transparency with the board, with the executive committee on those stress tests. If we're not going to do something specific about it, here's how it fits into the existing strategy. And then there are rare occasions where we do something very specific. Early stages of NAFTA was one of those when we actually explored, is there actually a NAFTA hedge that could be put on the books? What's the cost of that? And then in which case it will go into a working group in terms of what's something we can do specifically about that. Those working groups tend to show up more often in those operating models. So I think we've had an active working group on advances in medical life sciences, both on the impact of mortality, but also our underwriting techniques. It's been a standing working group for 3 years now.
Gary or Stephen?
Go ahead.
I think asking a question about a board within the public sector context is a very different organization than a financial institution or others. That being said, we have accountability structures and governance structures, obviously, within the organization, and there's a significant amount of risk reporting that goes on that moves forward to those tables that are considered when decisions are made on various items. So, I wouldn't say in terms of emerging risks, the focus, and we call it emerging risks, or you can also call it an environmental scan in terms of what's the environment that we're operating within and what are the risks associated with that environment in terms of achieving our outcome. And I think that's really been part of the work that we've been doing over the years in terms of applying it and understanding, again, going back to what's going to help us achieve or get to our destination.
Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is that I don't think we have a problem in identifying things and percolating them up to a board level. There isn't a filter that prevents us from doing that. I think the challenge we have at times is more akin to what was mentioned earlier, and that is that at a board level, if somebody gets stuck on something that is in the news, in the headlines, and thinks it could be material for us, when we know or are almost certain it isn't, we end up having to spend time on analyzing it and reporting on it, and that's taking time away from looking at something that is potentially much more material. And we don't have a solution to that. It just happens sometimes.
Over here?
What are some of the approaches you take to quantifying the impacts of these emerging risks, and to answer the questions from the board or wherever they come from?
I've led off every time. I don't know if somebody else wants to.
Jump in. A big part of what we've been doing with our framework is actually creating a common model so that we're all speaking the same language across the organization. And we look at how do we, and what is the model for assessing risk. Obviously, your 5x5 likelihood. But one of the things that I find interesting that we're really exploring is the speed of onset. And I think that that's an important piece to consider when you're looking at emerging risk, when you're looking at these big societal shifts or changes. It's not just likelihood and impact, it's how quickly will this happen, how do we anticipate, or when do we expect it, and that the other dimension or component, I think, is a key part to building in and considering emerging risks as well. You may need to think about a model a little differently than likelihood and impact when it comes to the emerging. I think that's really where, and that's where GRAFT brings in the trend piece that I think aligns, really well with that. It's not just the risk itself, but what's that trend, and where do we see things moving over time, and how do we keep track of that?
I hope this answer isn't overly simplistic, but in many cases we don't even attempt to quantify it, particularly in the business model and operating type of instances. If we can point that it hits a number of material business lines or it hits a material distribution channel, that's good enough for us. And so we're actually wasting our time trying to quantify it. We will take into account speed of onset. I think that's an important aspect. And then the capital markets one, again, probably not overly satisfying, but stress test it. If it were to happen, what does it do to your portfolio? We're really looking for order of magnitude. We're not looking for a lot of precision.
I would say, maybe just add on to that for RBC's approach, one of the hallmarks that we see around a lot of our emerging risks is there's a real lack of clarity around how these events will unfold. And it's one of the things we do when we do attempt to quantify it, because I would agree with Carrie, there's a number of times where you can't and probably shouldn't. But where we do feel more comfortable applying a stress testing lens to it, we really try to make sure that we apply a range of outcomes and try and look at it across sort of a scale of either NAFTA is a good example. It could be slight tweaks. It could be a tariff of NAFTA. It could be a tariff of NAFTA plus 25% tariff on autos. So you're sort of looking at various scenarios and trying to understand that we really don't know what the outcome is going to be, and so we don't want to hang our hat on one number.
And sort of to continue on with the GRAFT research, really looking at scenario analysis, stress testing, and we have one project specifically underway with BB Analytics are here, and is Sergey here? Well, my partner in crime is not here. And we're looking at specifically quantifying cyber attack risk. So putting a drill down framework around it, and then also putting some more modeling around. And again, starting out with orders of magnitude and then drilling down to get more granularity around it, but yet to be determined. Over here?
So you guys are risk experts, so you guys know a lot about risk, but I think that it's been said a couple of times already, and I agree, that it's important to engage people in the business side and the non-risk experts. And so I guess I want to know, and I want to get your opinion on what is the best way to really properly engage people from like the business or the operations side to really understand the importance of making risk assessments and also get their opinions on potential emerging risks.
Who wants to?
Well, I mean, just very briefly, I spoke earlier about some of the more complex emerging risks or trends that we are going a lot deeper on, geopolitical risk, disruptive technology, climate change, and we have in all cases created cross-departmental forums with representation from all the businesses. Anybody that can bring a different perspective or subject matter expertise that will help in enhancing our understanding of that risk or trend. And we found that to be extremely helpful.
I would say keep it simple. It's not about process and forms and filling in templates and tools and inundating people with a process, but rather about the conversation. So engaging those areas, of course you need to capture the information, roll it up, but in engaging those areas where there may not be an understanding or appreciation for that, it really is about the conversation. It really is about focusing on, what are you trying to achieve and what's going to help you and or stop you from achieving that. And I think everybody's thinking about that all the time. Like, risk is part of walking down the street and how far back you stand from the side of the road in Toronto versus Wawa. Everybody's doing it all the time. So how do you make it relatable for them? And I think keeping it simple and focusing on what's going to help you or stop you from achieving what your objective is, and then building from there. Once you get an understanding of it, you can begin to build and say, here's how I can help drive that out or help you move forward.
Carrie?
So first off, that giant goose in Wawa is quite scary.
Yeah, falling apart too.
So there are risks in Wawa. That said, I think Steve basically gave my exact answer, so I'm not going to say anything else.
Brian, the last word?
I'll echo a couple of comments just to say that I think what we've tried to do at RBC, and it operates differently in different areas, but at least provide a forum for that discussion. So there is some value in having sort of being embedded in the business portfolio reviews that I talked about, where we're collecting information, but really trying to have much more focus of just having an opportunity for dialogue between the businesses and risk to work through whatever the issues may be and debate them and discuss what the actions that we should take maybe if that's the case. But really just having a forum for that dialogue I think is most important.
Well, and on that note, we're at 000. When we come out to work with your organizations and we do graft workshops, we always try to do it both with the people in risk and with the people that are the business heads, because that's who's going to identify those emerging and evolving risks that we're all facing. So thank you so much for saying, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insight and for ending off our working group.